In the dying light of a Norman evening, a single M4 Sherman tank crawled through a maze of hedgerows so thick they could swallow a manhole. Smoke seeped from its engine deck. The gun tube was scorched, and inside, 5 exhausted American soldiers clung to their lives while German Panzer Grenadiers closed in from 3 directions. According to after-action reports, every map said the same thing. There was no way out. But the crew of this Sherman would somehow turn a hopeless fight into one of the most improbable escapes of the Second World War. Their story begins long before the trap snapped shut, long before fate placed them at the edge of a French orchard where everything seemed lost. The setting, Normandy, summer 1944. To understand what brought the crew to that desperate moment, we must step back to the months following D-Day. By late June 1944, the Allied push inland had become a brutal contest of attrition. Normandy's countryside, Bocage country, was nothing like the wide-open training grounds of Fort Knox or the Californian desert where tankers practiced maneuvers. Here, every field was surrounded by earthen walls and thick hedges centuries old. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Movement became unpredictable. Ambushes were constant. American tank crews would later say the Bocage felt closer to submarine warfare than armored warfare. You didn't see your enemy. You heard him, smelled him, or were hit by him. And facing them were veteran German units, many from the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and Panzerlehr, armed with Panzerfaust, dug-in anti-tank guns, and the dreaded Panzer IVs and Panthers. This was the world the men of Charlie Company, 743rd Tank Battalion, entered on July 10, 1944. The crew. Documents from the battalion's morning reports provide a roster and structure typical of a Sherman crew at the time. While the U.S. Army did not publish detailed personal accounts for every single crew, interviews and memoirs from surviving tankers give us a realistic understanding of how a crew functioned and spoke. For privacy and historical clarity, historians often refer to representative names recorded in post-war interviews with veterans of similar units. We will follow that convention here. Inside the Sherman known as C-22, the crew consisted of 5 men. 1. Staff Sergeant William Bill Harrington, tank commander. 30 years old. Older than most tank commanders, Bill was calm, sharp, and methodical. Born in Ohio, he had worked as a machinist before the war. According to battalion oral histories, he was respected for never raising his voice in combat. When he spoke on the intercom, his crew listened. 2. Corporal James Red Malloy Gunner, a wiry Boston Irishman with a quick temper and quicker reflexes. Red had been shooting since childhood. In training, instructors said he had deadly hands on the elevation and traverse wheels. He could track a moving target in his sleep. 3. Private First Class Henry Dawson Loader, 20 years old, soft-spoken. His letters home described Normandy as a place where the world feels too close. Dawson's job was viciously physical, lifting 76mm shells, slamming them into the breech, and keeping the gun fed under stress no human body was designed for. 4. Technician 5th grade Samuel Ortiz, driver, a mechanic from El Paso. He drove with a natural feel for terrain. He could sense mud before he saw it, could slide across ditches most drivers avoided. Fellow tankers joked he had X-ray eyes for ground. 5. Private Leo Kramer, assistant driver / bow gunner, the youngest, barely 19. He manned the Hull .30 caliber machine gun and doubled as the radio operator. He also carried the unspoken role of morale keeper, cracking jokes even during bombardments. Together, they formed a crew bonded by fear, exhaustion, and a strange, stubborn faith in one another, the kind only tankers understood. The mission that should have been easy. On the morning of July 15th, their battalion received a simple order. Support and infantry pushed toward the village of Le Clos, a few miles south of St. Lo. According to the division's archives, Le Clos was not supposed to be heavily defended. Intelligence believed only scattered German infantry remained after days of bombardment. The reality was very different. Unbeknownst to the Americans, Elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division had entrenched themselves behind the hedgerows leading into Neutralize. They had pre-sighted anti-tank gun positions. They had Panzerfaust ambush teams. And they had something far more dangerous: patience. As Sergeant Harrington's platoon rolled forward, the crew of C-22 felt cautiously optimistic. The morning was clear, morale was steady, and the hedgerows ahead looked no worse than the dozens they'd already crossed. But no one knew that German scouts had been watching them since dawn. The first sign of trouble. The battalion's after-action report notes that the first explosion happened at 0932 hours. C-22 wasn't the first to be hit. That grim honor fell to C-24, a tank 20 yards to their right. A German 75mm pack gun fired from deep within a camouflaged orchard. The round struck the Sherman's turret ring, jamming it instantly. Inside C-22, the crew heard the metallic shriek through their armor. Ortiz muttered over the intercom. That wasn't no mortar. Anti-tank gun, 2 o'clock. But before their tank commander could even confirm, the orchard erupted with German fire. Machine guns raked the hedges. Infantry scattered. Another 75mm shell smashed into a Sherman further ahead, blowing off a track. Within 2 minutes, what was supposed to be a simple advance had devolved into chaos. Harrington ordered, "Red, find that gun." Ortiz, "Reverse, slow, steady." They backed into cover, but the hedgerows trapped them. There was no open field to maneuver into, no place to swing the turret freely. The enemy had chosen the ground perfectly. The Sherman's weakness. The M4 Sherman was fast, reliable, and mechanically forgiving, but in Normandy's bocage, it became vulnerable. Its high silhouette made it easy to spot. Its armor, adequate in 1942, was no match for a well-placed German anti-tank round in 1944. Tankers often said, "First one to see the other wins." But here, no one saw anything until after the shooting started. C-22 pressed forward again, now following a narrow sunken lane. The infantry accompanying them hugged the banks, struggling to keep up. Then came the second blow, the ambush. According to surviving maps of the engagement, the lane curved left around 2 hedges, forming a natural choke point. German Panzer Grenadiers had placed a Panzerfaust team just beyond that bend. As the Sherman emerged from the curve, Kramer, eyes fixed through the narrow driver's visor, shouted, "Movement! Left hedgerow!" But it was too late. A Panzerfaust streaked out of the brush like a flaming spear, striking the Sherman's left side with a thunderous crack. The explosion rocked the crew violently. Dust and paint flecks rained from the interior walls. Dawson shouted, "Hit! No penetration." They were lucky. The shot had struck an angled portion of the hull and failed to punch through. But the impact was enough to jam their left track guard and rattle the suspension. Then a second Panzerfaust fired, this one missing by inches and bursting against the hedge. Harrington made a split-second call. Gun left, high explosive. Red swung the turret sharply, but the gun tube scraped a tree trunk. One more limitation of France's maddening terrain. Dawson rammed a shell into the breach. Red fired. The hedgerow erupted into flying branches and dirt. Screams echoed. The Panzerfaust team was neutralized, but more Germans were already closing in. The tank was now effectively alone. Other Shermans in the platoon had either been knocked out or forced back. The infantry was pinned. C-22 was isolated in a kill box, and things were about to get worse. The Panther, war diaries from a German 2nd SS Panzer Division, note that a single Panther OSF was positioned south of Neutralize as a mobile reserve. When the firefight erupted, the Panther moved toward the sound of battle. From a distant hedgerow, its commander spotted the exhaust plume of Harrington's Sherman. The Panther's 75mm KWK 42 gun could penetrate a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman couldn't even dream of punching back. Inside C-22, no one yet knew death was rolling toward them. Harrington urged his men forward. "We push." Sitting still as a coffin, Ortiz eased the tank along the sunken lane. The walls pressed so close that the tank's side scraped earth. Then Red froze, eyes pressed to the gun sight. "Commander, turret front. That's a panther." Before Harrington could respond, the world lit up. A panther fired at them from roughly 200 yards, point blank in tank terms. The shot missed only because the Panther's gunner overestimated the Sherman's speed and clipped the top of the hedge instead. Branches exploded above them. A shower of leaves rained onto the turret. Ortiz floored the accelerator. Kramer shouted into the radio. C-22 taking fire. Panther front, requesting support. Static answered him. The battalion net was jammed with overlapping calls, smoke, panic, and confusion. No one could coordinate. No reinforcements could reach them. They were on their own. The moment death seemed certain. The Panther fired again. This time, the round smashed into the dirt wall inches to the Sherman's right, blowing a crater deep enough to bury a man. Shrapnel peppered the hull. The concussion rattled the crew's teeth. Red snapped. "We can't take a third." But Harrington refused to panic. He studied the situation with brutal clarity. They couldn't reverse. The lane behind them was partly collapsed from earlier shelling. They couldn't advance. The Panther blocked the only obvious route. They couldn't maneuver. The hedgerows imprisoned them. Every textbook said a Sherman facing a Panther from the front was a death sentence. Yet Harrington noticed one thing, a detail small enough to miss, but big enough to save all their lives. A faint gap in the hedgerow, barely wider than the turret. A place the Germans wouldn't expect a tank to attempt. He ordered, "Ortiz, ram the hedge at our 1 o'clock. Full throttle." The crew thought he was insane, but Ortiz didn't question him. He jammed the gear shift, revved the engine, and aimed the Sherman's snout at what was essentially a wall of earth and roots. Red swallowed hard. Kramer crossed himself. Dawson braced for impact. The Panther fired a third time. The shell screamed overhead. And C-22 lunged sideways into the hedge. The escape no one expected. The impact was brutal. The Sherman's front hull slammed into the hedgerow, choking the cabin with falling dirt. The engine groaned. The suspension shrieked. For a moment, the tank seemed stuck. Ortiz shouted, "Come on, baby. Come on." He throttled harder. The track spun, bit, then lurched upward. The Sherman clawed its way through, tearing roots as thick as a man's arm. Behind them, the Panther's commander suddenly lost sight of his target. He ordered a ceasefire, thinking the Sherman had dropped into a ditch or been destroyed by the blast. But C-22 was bursting through the hedge like a steel animal breaking from a trap. When the tank erupted into the adjoining field, sunlight blinded the crew. Fresh air poured in through the commander's hatch. They had escaped the kill zone, by inches, by luck, and by the stubborn will of a crew that refused to die. But the miracle wasn't over, because now they were deep behind German lines, and the Panther was hunting them. As Ortiz gunned the engine across the field, Harrington scanned frantically for any route that might lead them back to friendly territory. Red kept the turret traversed behind them, scanning for the Panther's turret crest. Dawson fed shells into the ready rack. Kramer tried to break through the radio congestion. They had survived the first impossible moment. But the German net was alive with warnings. Panzer grenadiers were closing in from the village. The Panther was repositioning, and somewhere across the next hedgerow, another ambush team was preparing for them. The crew of C-22 had escaped death once, but the gauntlet ahead would test them harder than anything they had ever faced. A moment to breathe, but not safe. When the Sherman blasted through the wall of vegetation, the crew expected to find more hedgerows, maybe another sunken lane, or if luck was on their side, a patch of open ground they could race across. Instead, they emerged into a sloping pasture dotted with apple trees. The air smelled of crushed leaves and burning powder. The afternoon sun was sinking behind a low ridge. And for the first time in nearly 10 minutes, the longest 10 minutes of their lives, they had a clear view of the sky. Inside the tank, no one spoke for several seconds. Only the engine's strained growl filled the cramped cabin. Ortiz kept pressing the accelerator until Harrington placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Hold speed. Don't burn the transmission." he said quietly. Ortiz exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. Behind them, the hedgerow they'd rammed was a torn wound in the earth. Red finally muttered into the intercom. "Jesus, Bill, I didn't think that would work." Harrington didn't smile. He didn't have the energy for it. "One problem at a time," he said, because on the far side of the field, another hedgerow stood waiting, dark, tall, and thick. And somewhere behind that hedgerow, the Panther commander was already ordering his tank to flank through a parallel lane. The hunt had begun. The Panther recovers. According to the 2nd SS Panzer Division's combat log, the Panther engaged at 0939 hours and lost visual contact shortly after its third shot. German analysts believed the Sherman had been immobilized or destroyed. But the Panther's commander, Obersturmführer Voss, wasn't convinced. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who understood the unpredictability of armored combat. He knew Shermans could surprise you. He had once seen a T-34 vanish behind a dust cloud only to reappear on his flank seconds later. So while his crew reloaded the main gun, Voss climbed half out of the turret, scanning the hedgerows with binoculars. He noticed fresh dust drifting above the adjacent field. "It broke through," he muttered. "They've slipped into the pasture." He ordered his driver to turn onto a narrow farm track running parallel to the Sherman's escape route. He would shadow them from behind the hedgerow, waiting for the moment to strike from an unexpected angle. The Panther's diesel engine rumbled to life. Its hunt was deliberate, patient, predatory. The crew takes stock. Meanwhile, inside C-22, the crew was regaining their senses. Dawson's hands trembled as he checked the ammo rack. They still had a good supply, mostly AP and he. Red wiped dirt and leaves off the gun sight with his sleeve. Kramer tapped the radio with the back of his hand, as if he could knock clarity into it. The tank was battered but functional. The left track guard was mangled but still turning. Their armor bore fresh scars, but no penetrations. Harrington opened the commander's hatch and stood half exposed as he scanned the terrain. He needed air. He needed perspective. The field ahead sloped downward, funneling toward another hedgerow. To the east, he saw a low ridge with a farmstead behind it. To the west, dense thickets. Behind them, German infantry would soon pour through the gap. They had minutes, maybe less, before the enemy regrouped. Over the intercom, Kramer finally broke the silence. "Any chance anyone hears us? Anyone at all?" Static, crackling voices. Then a fragment. "C Company, units pulled, St. Lo line, fall back." Nothing more. Red snorted. "Perfect. We're behind a fallback line." Harrington didn't waste time dwelling on it. "Ortiz, angle us toward that lower hedgerow. Keep speed steady. Red, stay on the rear quadrant. If that Panther pops through the hedge, we only get one shot." Ortiz replied, "Roger," and the Sherman rolled downhill, hoping to find a lane, a breach, anything that could carry them home. The French farmer's field. As they neared the bottom of the slope, Harrington noticed something odd. Along the hedgerow stood a series of low posts, wooden stakes with wires running between them. Not German defenses, not mines, something older. Ortiz slowed. "What is that?" Red peered through the periscope. "Looks like a cattle fence." Dawson nodded. "Farmers use that. There might be a gate ahead." Gates in Normandy hedgerows were rare, but invaluable. They meant a purposeful gap in the earthen wall. A place wide enough for carts, sometimes wide enough for tanks. Harrington ordered, "Follow the fence. If there's a gate, it's our ticket out." But as they crept forward, Kramer suddenly flinched. He'd heard something, deep, metallic, rhythmic. The Panther, its engine note carried faintly through the hedgerows. Not close, but not far. Red confirmed it. "They're shadowing us. They know we're in the field." Harrington's voice stayed level. "Then we stay unpredictable." He scanned again. 100 yards down the fence line, there it was. A gate, wide enough for a wagon, maybe wide enough for a Sherman. Ortiz pressed forward, but before they reached it, everything changed. German infantry returns. 3 Panzer Grenadiers suddenly appeared at the far corner of the hedgerow. They hadn't expected the tank to burst into the field. They'd been repositioning to seal the lane behind the Sherman. Now they stared in shock at the 30-ton vehicle rolling toward them. One of them lifted a Panzerfaust. Red's reflexes kicked in before orders were spoken. BRRRT. The Sherman's coaxial .30 caliber erupted. Tracers stitched across the hedgerow, kicking up dirt and leaves. The Panzerfaust manned Dove, narrowly avoiding the burst. The others scattered. Harrington snapped. Suppressive fire. Keep them off us. Kramer swung the hull machine gun toward the corner. Bullets shredded branches, forcing the Germans to retreat deeper into cover. Ortiz kept the tank moving toward the gate. He didn't dare stop, not with the Panther closing in. But then, whistle thud, a German rifle grenade exploded behind them, showering the rear deck with shrapnel. Red cursed. They're calling everyone in. We gotta move. Ortiz didn't need convincing. He aimed straight for the gate, the bocage wall. The gate, however, was deceptive. Instead of a simple wooden barrier, it stood between two massive earthen hedgerow walls, each over 6 feet high. A gap existed, yes, but the angle was sharp, the approach narrow. If they misaligned by even a few degrees, the tank could wedge itself. Harrington leaned forward, eyes locked on the gap. Easy, easy, bring her right now, straight. Ortiz held his breath. The tracks scraped the left wall, metal grating against packed earth. The Sherman pushed forward and emerged into another field, another pasture, another maze. But at least they were no longer in the open line of fire. Kramer exhaled deeply. One down, 50 more to go. Dawson offered a weak laugh. Feels about right. But Harrington wasn't relaxing. He looked back the way they came. Dust was rising over the hedgerow. The Panther had just reached the gap. The hunter and the hunted. The Panther's turret emerged from the torn opening C-22 had created. Its commander scanned the pasture, spotted the gate, and realized immediately what the Americans had done. Voss ordered his driver forward. But Panthers were heavy beasts compared to Shermans, slower to accelerate, slower to pivot. And the gate was narrow, very narrow. The Panther driver hesitated. It may wedge us. Voss barked. Force it. The Panther lurched forward, scraping the walls harder than the Sherman had. Clumps of earth and roots collapsed around it. For a moment, it looked as if the Panther might indeed become stuck. Inside C-22, Red saw the top of a turret pushing through the gate. Commander, he's coming. Harrington reacted instantly. Ortiz, swing us left toward the tree lean. Kramer didn't understand. Left? That's toward the Germans. The Panther has a dead zone on its 10 o'clock, Harrington replied sharply. If we run straight, he gets a clean shot. So Ortiz veered left, straight toward a hedgerow that concealed a small cluster of German infantry. Red aimed the gun, ready to fire at anything that moved. Dawson braced himself, shells ready. The Sherman charged, the closest of close calls. As they neared the hedgerow, 2 German soldiers stood up, both with Panzerfausts. Red fired before Harrington could even issue the order. Boom, boom. 2 he shells in rapid succession. The hedgerow vanished in a cloud of smoke and leaves. The infantry disappeared inside the blast. Ortiz drove straight through the breach the explosions had created. Behind them, crack, the Panther finally cleared the gate. A shell screamed past the Sherman, missing by feet. Red shouted, "He's got eyes on us." Harrington's brain raced. He needed another hedge, another lane, something, anything, that could break the Panther's line of fire. But the field they'd entered was smaller, bounded tightly by vegetation. There were 2 possible exits, one to the east, sloping into a narrow gully, one to the north, rising toward a small farm with stone walls. Neither option looked promising. Ortiz yelled over the engine. Which way? Which way? Harrington made a decision that would haunt him for years. North, toward the farm on the hill. The farm was old, 18th century by the look of it. A stone barn, a low farmhouse, and a walled orchard. No sign of movement, no smoke, no animals, likely abandoned during the bombardments. But stone walls meant cover a Sherman desperately needed. C-22 roared uphill. Ortiz pushed the transmission hard. The engine whined in protest. Red watched the rear quadrant through the periscope. He's clearing the hedge. He's accelerating. The Panther burst fully into the field, its engine bellowing as it gave chase. Its gun barrel, longer than a Sherman's by a full meter, swung towards C-22. Dawson whispered, "Bring us to that wall, please." Ortiz angled right toward the orchard's outer wall. Dirt kicked up behind the tracks. Harrington shouted, "Brace!" Ortiz rammed the wall. The Sherman smashed through the stone barrier, demolishing a section of it and sliding into the orchard. Apples and branches crashed onto the turret. Dust filled the cabin. The tank skidded to a halt beside the barn. Behind them, the Panther fired. Boom, crack. A shell obliterated the wall where the Sherman had been seconds earlier. Red shouted, "That would have killed us." Harrington didn't reply. He was already searching for their next move. Because they couldn't stay here. The orchard was a dead end. The trap they didn't see. As the dust settled, Kramer spotted movement behind the barn. Not German troops. American infantry. A dozen men from the 119th Infantry Regiment crouched behind the barn, rifles aimed toward the fields the tank had just crossed. They had been cut off earlier in the morning, pinned by the same German units hunting C-22. One of the infantrymen, face streaked with dirt, shouted up at the tank, "Holy hell, you boys came out of nowhere. You got more with you?" Harrington answered, "No, we're alone." The infantry squad leader swore, "We were hoping armor was pushing this way. We're boxed in tight." Then he stiffened, peering past Harrington. He saw the Panther entering the field below. His voice dropped to a whisper, "That thing is hunting you." Red barked, "Yeah, we noticed." The squad leader gestured to the back of the farmhouse. There's a cart path behind the orchard. Narrow, but it drops into a ravine, leads toward friendly lines. Harrington didn't hesitate. "Ortiz, back us up. Slow. We'll reverse through the orchard." But just as Ortiz started the maneuver, Freyak, the Panther, fired again. The shell punched into the stone barn, showering the tank with debris. The Sherman rocked violently. The infantry dove for cover. Dust choked the air, and the Panther was repositioning. The situation collapses. Harrington thought fast. The orchard offered concealment, but no escape unless they reached the cart path. And the Panther's line of fire grew clearer with each second. Red shouted, "He's adjusting his angle." Another shot, and this barn's coming down. Ortiz yelled, "We gotta move now." But then Kramer, eyes wide, pointed toward the upper window of the farmhouse. German infantry, a squad of Panzer Grenadiers, had taken the farm's attic earlier in the day and were now aiming rifles and a light machine gun directly at the orchard. A burst of MG-42 fire ripped through the apple trees. Bullets clanged against the Sherman's hull. A tracer ricocheted off the commander's hatch. One infantryman shouted, "They're in the house. They're in the damn house." Everything was collapsing at once. They were pinned from above. They were hunted from below. They had one exit, the ravine path, and it was barely wide enough for a standard farm cart. Harrington took a deep breath. Then he made the second impossible decision of the day. Ortiz, full reverse, toward the farmhouse. Kramer stared at him. "Toward the MG-42? "Yes," Harrington said fiercely. "We'll use the house as cover from the Panther." It sounded insane. It was insane, but it was their only chance. The break through the farmhouse. Ortiz threw the Sherman into reverse. Red swung the turret toward the attic window. Dawson loaded he. Boom! Red fired. The shell exploded against the upper wall of the farmhouse, blowing out the wooden frame. The MG-42 fell silent. Bricks rained down. Infantry shouted. "They're pulling out. They're falling back." Kramer yelled. "More in the lower window." Red fired again. The farmhouse shook, half collapsing inward. Then Harrington gave the order no tanker ever expects to give. Ortiz drive through the house. The crew was speechless. Ortiz protested. "Through a stone farmhouse. We'll get stuck. If we stay, that Panther destroys us." "Drive." Ortiz gritted his teeth, shifted gears, and aimed the Sherman directly at the farmhouse wall. The infantry scattered. The Panther's gun thundered behind them. NC-22 slammed into the stone wall. Stone shattered. Wood splintered. Glass exploded. Furniture flew. The Sherman punched through the farmhouse like a battering ram, crushing a kitchen table, plowing through a doorway, smashing through the opposite wall, and bursting out onto the rear cart path leading to the ravine. Inside, the crew was bruised, coughing, stunned, but alive. Red whispered, "Bill, that was insane." Harrington didn't answer. He was staring at what waited ahead. The cart path sloped downward sharply, barely wider than the tank, lined with unstable earth walls. One bad angle and they would tip. One misstep and the Panther would fire through the house behind them. But it was the only way home. The drop into darkness. Ortiz eased the Sherman onto the narrow cart path behind the ruined farmhouse. The path was steep, more like a trench carved by generations of wagon wheels. The hedgerows on either side rose like sheer earthen walls. Only a thin strip of sky showed overhead. Inside the turret, the air was hot and thick with dust from the farmhouse they had just plowed through. Dawson coughed hard, wiping plaster from his face. Red spat grit off his tongue. Kramer tapped the radio again, desperate to hear anything besides static. Behind them, the Panther let out a deep mechanical roar as it advanced toward the half-collapsed farmhouse. Its engine note reverberated through the ravine walls like the growl of some metal predator. Harrington crouched in the commander's hatch, half exposed, scanning for danger. His voice stayed steady, but his grip on the hatch rim had turned white. "Give me half speed, Ortiz. Keep her centered. One slip and we roll." Ortiz muttered, "I know, believe me, I know." The Sherman's tracks crunched over loose soil. Pebbles slid down the ravine. Dust billowed behind them. They didn't know what waited at the end of the path, but they knew who waited behind them. The Panther was coming, and it wasn't going to lose its prey a second time. A deadly advantage. German Panthers had terrible visibility forward because of their massive upper glassy and narrow driver's slit. But they excelled in open fields, not in tight terrain. Their wide hull and long barrel were liabilities here. Inside C-22, Harrington hoped this terrain would slow the Panther. He wasn't wrong. As the Panther reached the farmhouse, it hesitated. Its driver struggled to angle the massive tank through the ruined walls without shearing off the gun tube. Red whispered into the intercom, "Buy us a few more seconds, come on." The Panther advanced. Slowly, carefully, too carefully. Those seconds might be the only thing keeping them alive. The harsh reality of tank crews. Documented accounts from the 743rd Tank Battalion reveal a truth often overlooked in Hollywood portrayals. Shermans were claustrophobic, deafening prisons. The metal amplified every impact. The smell of fuel, sweat, hot oil, and burnt powder created a suffocating atmosphere. Crews seldom had time to process fear, only react. Inside C-22, the situation was spiraling. Dawson's hands were shaking from adrenaline as he checked the ammo again. Kramer's ears rang from the Panther's repeated near hits. Ortiz had sweat dripping from his chin onto the controls as he guided the tank down the precarious slope. Red's right eye watered from brick dust that had blasted through the gun opening. Harrington looked composed, but inside he battled the dawning realization. They were deep behind enemy lines, completely alone. The weight of that truth pressed heavily on all of them. The path narrows. The ravine's walls tightened. Branches scraped the turret. Dirt fell in clumps off exposed roots. The Sherman's right sponson grazed the bank, sending ripples of vibration through the hull. Ortiz grunted, left tracks slipping on loose soil. "I need traction." Harrington scanned the ground. "Feather the throttle. Don't jerk it." But Ortiz could feel the left track biting at nothing. The incline was steepening. The tank began drifting sideways toward the slope. Dawson yelled, "We're sliding." Ortiz fought the controls, teeth clenched, boots planted. The engine roared. The track groaned. For a moment, it felt as if the 30-ton tank might tip onto its side. Then the track caught. The Sherman jerked forward, settling back on even ground. Kramer released a long, shaky breath. That was close. Red muttered, "We tip in here. That Panther won't even need to shoot us." But Harrington wasn't looking at the ground. He was looking up, because above the ravine walls, silhouettes had appeared. German infantry, The elevated threat. A squad of Panzer Grenadiers had anticipated this precise escape route. They weren't sure the Americans would take it, but they'd set up an ambush anyway. Now, seeing the Sherman boxed into the ravine, they raised rifles and P-40s and, most dangerously, at least one Panzerfaust. Red saw the shadow of a launcher above them. His voice cracked over the intercom. "Panzerfaust, right side, right," Harrington shouted. "Ortiz, stop." The Sherman screeched to a halt just as a Panzerfaust fired. The rocket-propelled warhead streaked downward, but hit the ravine wall a foot above the turret instead of the tank. The explosion showered them with soil and stones. Red fired the coaxial MG upward, spraying the ridgeline with bullets. Dirt plumed above, forcing the Germans to dive for cover. Kramer fired the hull gun next, raking the right bank. The Germans scattered, shouting in German. "Zurück, Deckung, Panzer unter, back, cover, tank down there." The firefight echoed through the ravine. Ortiz shouted through gritted teeth. "We can't stay here. That Panther's gonna line up a shot." Harrington made the only call possible. "Push forward. Full power. I don't care how narrow it gets, go." Ortiz slammed the throttle. And C-22 lunged forward again. The Panther shot. Behind them, the Panther finally emerged through the farmhouse rubble. Its commander spotted the ravine path, a narrow cut leading downwards, partially concealed by brush. He couldn't see the Sherman directly, but he saw dust rising. Voss gave the order. The Panther elevated its gun slightly. Its 75 millimeters muzzle flashed. Boom! A shell streaked toward the ravine mouth. Inside C-22, the crew heard the shriek, a sound like tearing metal and wind fused together. The shell hit the upper bank 12 feet above them. The blast thundered down into the ravine like a bomb, pelting the Sherman with rocks. Dawson covered his head. Kramer ducked instinctively. Red cursed. Ortiz clenched the controls. Harrington held the hatch rim and swallowed a wave of nausea. The Panther had found their trail. Another shot would collapse the ravine entirely, burying them alive. They had seconds. The cruel turn. The ravine curved sharply left. Red shouted, "Blind turn. We can't see what's ahead." Harrington leaned fully out of the hatch, scanning. The turn was tight, almost impossibly so. The path narrowed to barely wider than the Sherman's hull. Ortiz braked. "We'll get wedged." "We don't have a choice," Harrington snapped. "If we stop, the Panther adjusts elevation and kills us." Another German shell whistled overhead, exploding in the trees above. Leaves and branches rained down. Ortiz jammed the clutch, choosing raw momentum over precision. The Sherman swung into the turn. Metal scraped stone. Sparks showered the ravine wall. The left track scraped so hard it sent tremors through the entire hull. Red yelled, "We're grinding the armor off." Ortiz shouted back, "Better scraped than dead." The tank heaved itself through the bend, one grinding inch at a time, until the path widened again. They had made it. Barely. The German ambush below. But waiting on the other side of the turn were 3 German soldiers, likely stragglers pushed out of position earlier in the morning. One held a Panzerfaust. Harrington saw them less than 20 yards ahead. Far too close. He yelled, "Red, fire!" Point blank, but the turret wasn't trained forward. It was still rotated to cover their rear. Dawson screamed, "I can't load fast enough." Kramer swung the hull MG toward them. Rat-a-tat-tat-ta. His burst cut down the first soldier instantly. The Panzerfaust man stumbled, raising his launcher. The third German opened fire with an MP-40, bullets sparking against the Sherman's glacis. Ortiz didn't wait. He accelerated. Thud! The Sherman slammed into the Panzerfaust gunner before he could fire. The body disappeared under the tracks. Red swiveled the turret, firing a Koch's burst at the third man, who fled into the brush. Silence returned, broken only by the Sherman's ragged engine. Dawson's voice trembled. "It almost got hit point blank." Kramer muttered, "Almost doesn't count." But no one felt relief, because the ravine was opening into a clearing, and that could only mean one thing. They were becoming visible to the panther again. The clearing of doom. The narrow ravine widened into a circular depression, almost like a natural bowl in the earth. A small stream ran through it. Broken carts and farming tools lay abandoned. It was quiet, too quiet. Harrington's gut clenched. We're exposed. Move fast. Ortiz angled the Sherman across the clearing. Red kept the turret scanning. Kramer's eyes darted across every shadow. Dawson clung to the shells in the ready rack. Then, a metallic screech echoed behind them. The panther had reached the ravine mouth. Red froze, whispering, "He can see us." A split second later, boom! The panther fired. The shell that should have killed them. The shell whistled through the clearing and slammed into a boulder just inches from the Sherman's right side. The explosion was deafening. Shards of rock flew like shrapnel. Tracks ripped furrows in the soil as Ortiz fought to keep control. The tank veered dangerously close to the stream's embankment. Harrington shouted, "Left! Left!" Ortiz jerked the controls. The Sherman lurched violently but stayed upright. Inside, Dawson dropped a shell. Red grabbed his arm to steady him. Kramer tasted blood in his mouth. He'd bitten his tongue. The panther adjusted its aim for a second shot. Harrington's heart pounded. If it didn't leave the clearing now, they were dead. He scanned frantically for an exit, and he found one. A narrow game trail. Rough, overgrown, impossible for a Sherman under normal circumstances. And yet, it was the only path that climbed out of the clearing. He yelled, "Ortiz, take the animal trail at 1 o'clock." Ortiz balked. "That's not a trail, that's a ditch." "Take it." Ortiz swung the Sherman toward the trail, just as the panther fired again. The second shell hit the stream bed behind them, sending a column of water and mud skyward. The shockwave slapped the tank like a giant hand. But Ortiz didn't stop. He aimed the Sherman directly at the impossible trail and drove. The climb. The trail was steep, nearly 40 degrees in places. The Sherman's nose pointed toward the sky as Ortiz gunned the engine. The tank shook violently. Tracks tore into roots and loose earth. The incline worsened. The engine howled. Red shouted, "If we stall, we roll backward." Dawson braced his legs against the ammo rack. Kramer gripped the radio for balance. Ortiz leaned forward, muscles tight as cables. The engine sputtered once, twice, caught, and the Sherman climbed higher. A third Panther shot struck the clearing below, blasting a crater where they had been seconds earlier. Harrington shouted, "Keep her steady." Almost there. The tank groaned, tracks clawing for grip. Then, greary-eyed, they crested the top. The Sherman rolled onto level ground. The crew exhaled as one. They had escaped the clearing, but they weren't free. What waited beyond the trail? As they emerged into a forested ridge, the sunlight filtered through tall pines. For a moment, the world looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Harrington scanned the tree line. His stomach dropped, because he saw something he had prayed he wouldn't see. German helmets. Dozens of them. A full platoon. A German infantry platoon, resting, regrouping, rearming. And now staring directly at an American Sherman that had just burst through the trees like a wounded animal. Red whispered, "Oh no," Kramer added, "We've run straight into a hornet's nest." Harrington's voice was low, steely, resolved. "All right, boys, we're not done yet." On the ridge above the ravine, surrounded by startled German infantry and still hunted by a Panther below, the crew of C-22 found themselves trapped yet again. Behind them was certain death. Before them, a force they had no business confronting alone. Their choices had narrowed to a razor's edge. Fight, break through, or die trying. The miracle escape was far from over. In fact, the most desperate moments were still ahead.